Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, and welcome to this dialogue organized by the IISD on the implementation of a possible WTO Fisheries Subsidies Agreement, which many of you are working extremely hard on, so we're very grateful for your time. Welcome to those of you who are joining online. I know there are a number of you, and welcome also to those of you who are joining us in person in the room. My name's Alice Tipping. I know most of you, but for those I don't yet know, I lead IISD's work on trade policy here in the Geneva office, and I'm accompanied here on the podium by my colleague Jeva Barszczałskaite, who will be presenting a bit later, and my colleague Eleonora Bonacorsi, who has put all of the technology together and will also be helping me to monitor the chat box when we get to the question time. So we're going to try and do this in as hybrid a form as we possibly can. Those of you in the room might be wondering why it's only IISD people on the podium. And that's because our expert speakers, many of whom were planning to be here in person, have all had their travel disrupted, including at least for one of them because they've come down with COVID. So Marcelo, we really hope you're feeling better. And thank you very much indeed for your commitment to delivering your presentation, even though you must be feeling a bit ill. So thank you for the dedication to the cause. So with that sort of brief introduction of who we are and why we're here, let me introduce a bit about this session and a bit about the experts that you're going to be hearing from. I mean, it almost doesn't even bear saying, but your negotiations on a new fisheries subsidies agreement are at a particularly crucial stage, particularly this week. And we've been encouraged over the last few weeks, over the last few days, and even over the last few hours to see that positions are gradually coming together on a number of topics, and we very much hope that the remaining gaps in the negotiations might be able to be bridged in the coming days. So that's why you're seeing a lot of us in the WTO for many days this week and next. So as you approach the finish line in the negotiations, you're also approaching a start line, right? You're at the beginning of the process of implementing this new agreement. And of course, implementation is where change actually happens, right? Where change in fisheries policy actually happens and where fiscal policy begins to become more aligned. So we've organized this session today to achieve a number of objectives. We'd like to encourage you all to think at the back of your minds about implementation and how you might approach it. And in our conversations over the last few days, we know that some of you already are thinking about exactly that, which is really encouraging. But we wanted also specifically to bring to Geneva voices of organizations that we think could be particularly helpful in supporting your implementation of this agreement. And so to do this, we've invited a number of key individuals to speak about the support that they and their organizations might be able to provide. So we have two representatives of the FAO based in Rome. We have Audun Lem, who's the Deputy Director of the Fisheries and Aquaculture Division at the FAO. And we have Marcelo Vasconcelos, who's a Fisheries Resources Officer also at the FAO. And both Marcelo and Audun will be familiar faces to some of you because they've been providing input to these negotiations, in fact, for many years. And I'm really delighted that they're able to come in at this last stage and help us again. We've asked Audun to say a few words, I think, about the FAO's institutional readiness to support implementation of this agreement. And Marcelo is going to talk in a little bit more detail about the support that the FAO provides specifically on fisheries management, how it's funded, and I think how to access it. And maybe a couple of words just to pause here on fisheries management and why we're bringing it into the discussion here. The agreement before you obviously disciplines subsidies, right? And the obligations the focus of the obligations in your text is very much on subsidies. But fisheries management is relevant. It's useful to access the exceptions if members choose to use them. But more broadly, for us, we think it's important to the overall effectiveness of the agreement. Subsidy reform works best when it's accompanied by good management of the resource, even if that looks like relatively simple management steps. So Marcelo is going to talk about the support the FAO can provide on fisheries management, given that background, and particularly, I think, some of the support they can provide to data collection, which we think is very relevant in the context of the transparency obligations in the text in Article 8. And I thought I would pause here just to note that even though we don't have Audun and Marcelo in person, we do have a representative from the FAO's office in Geneva. There he is at the very back, Geir Ulla, who's with us today. So thank you, Geir, for coming. So if any of you have questions, specifically about the FAO and its work, and would like to talk to the local person. There he is. So that's the FAO, and we're looking forward to hearing from them. Then we're going to hear from Charlotte de Fontaubert, who you can see on the screen. So Charlotte is the global lead on the blue economy at the World Bank, based in Washington, DC. And we've been talking, in fact, to the World Bank for a number of years now about this agreement and about the importance of supporting its implementation. And so Charlotte very graciously has agreed to come and talk about the bank's perspective on implementation of the agreement and about the assistance that they might be able to provide to you all in doing that. And I also wanted to note that even though we don't have Charlotte, we do have Pierre Sauvé from the bank's Geneva office, who conveniently is sitting right next to Guy at the back. So if you would like to speak directly to the representatives of the World Bank in Geneva, there's Pierre. And if you would like to be in touch with them later on, we're happy to facilitate those connections. So last but absolutely not least, we're going to hear from John Pierce, who is principal consultant at an organization called MRAG, so the Marine Resources Assessment Group. And that's a marine consultancy that's based in London. And they, in particular John, personally delivers a lot of technical assistance on fisheries related issues, both on policy frameworks and on the science of managing fisheries. So we've asked him to give us his very practical on the water perspective of how to ensure that technical assistance in the implementation of an international agreement can best work. So we'll have kind of two key agencies and somebody who from a very practical perspective does this work to provide with some perspectives. So once we've had those 4 interventions, I'll open the floor for questions and discussion. For those of you online, please put your questions into the chat box. We'll be watching it carefully. And Eleanor is going to help feed the questions to me as they come in. And Eva and I will keep an eye on the room for hands. So at the end of that discussion about the agencies and their support, I'm going to give the floor to Eva for her to do a short presentation about a tool that IISD is developing to support you all in the implementation of this agreement, and also in identifying the support that you might need to do so. And this is work that is taking a lot of internal effort, so credit to Eva and to my colleague Tristan for that. And it's work that we're doing with the support of the governments of Germany and Sweden and the Pew Charitable Trusts. They're all present here today. And I wanted to acknowledge very much their very generous support for this work, because it wouldn't be possible simply without it. So that is our 90-minute session. I've probably spoken enough for now. So without further ado, I might pass the floor first to you, Auden. Thank you again for joining us, and go ahead.
Thank you, Alice. Thank you, Alice, for inviting me to say a few words, and good afternoon to all of you, and greetings from Rome. And I really hope it's cooler in Geneva than it's here in the mid-30s. Now, first of all, let me give you some background about the relationship between FAO and the WTO on subsidies, on fishery subsidies. In fisheries, FAO collaborates with WTO in 2 specific areas, in many others, but in particular on 2 specific areas. The first one is capacity building on market access issues, and this involves fisheries and aquaculture products in general. And then the second area is technical support on fisheries topics involving the current negotiations on fishery subsidies. And on subsidies, the support has really been mostly on fisheries management, on the role of IUU, on capacity, and the role of the RFMOs, the Regional Fisheries Management Organization. So the capacity building has not been on subsidies as said, it has been on the structure of fisheries, it's been on fisheries management, and my colleague Marcel will come back to this more in detail. Years, FAO and WTO, we've implemented a number of very successful capacity building activities, and these have been covering a wide range of trade-related fish topics for WTO members in both presential and virtual events. Now, on fishery subsidies specifically, we have provided a continuous technical support on the main 3 pillars involved in the negotiation so far, and that is overfishing, overcapacity, and illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, or IUU. And whenever WTO has requested this support, we have provided it in events in Geneva, but also by seconding staff to the WTO Secretariat for specific periods. Now, in the last official meetings between the Director Generals of FAO and the WTO, there have been discussions on the possibility of a cooperation agreement between the two organizations with the purpose to provide technical assistance and capacity building associated with the implementation of a future agreement on fishery subsidies. And FAO, we have submitted input to a draft by the WTO on this, and currently WTO is analyzing the next steps in this process. And in addition, of course, there is a scope for much broader cooperation between FAO and WTO on trade-related issues beyond subsidies. And if needed, the fisheries and aquaculture trade cooperation could be enhanced by implementing joint schemes involving capacity building activities, also of various knowledge products, addressing market access in general, SPS, TBT issues, etc. And this could also include specific issues related to seafood trade, including the role of small-scale producers and food security issues. And of course, I remind you that this year, 2022, is the International Year of Artisanal Fisheries and Aquaculture. So in particular, we want to see a stronger focus on this in general. If we return to capacity building, FAO has a number of similar programs on fisheries-related issues, and one outstanding example is the ongoing program on the implementation of the FAO Port State Measures Agreement, the PSMA, which is a multi-donor program involving a number of signatories or observers to the PSMA agreement. It includes legal reviews of the national legislation, an assessment of infrastructure needs, a training of national staff, and sharing of best practice. It's based on the needs of each individual recipient country. It's demand-driven, and the focus is to cater to national needs and characteristics. And similarly for fishery subsidies, a potential FAO WTO instrument on capacity building could follow the same format to ensure effective delivery to stated country needs. And this could also, of course, include support on reporting, on data management, etc. Finally, I wish to assure all WTO members that FAO will continue to deliver impartial advice of the highest technical quality, focusing on the direct needs of each individual recipient. In short, many of us here will be in Lisbon for the UN Ocean Conference later this month. And one of the topics in Lisbon at the UN Ocean Conference is the SDG 14 and the various targets, including the one on a hopeful successful conclusion of the WTO negotiations on new fisheries discipline. So let's all work together towards that goal. Thank you, and back to you, Alice.
Oh, super. Thank you very much indeed, Audun. And it's extremely encouraging, I think, to know that the WTO and the FAO are already working on structuring and thinking about the cooperation to support the implementation of this agreement. So that's very encouraging. So thank you for those kind of more, I guess, more high level words of political support for joint work on implementation. That's extremely helpful. And I think now perhaps let's follow that sort of more higher level statement with a bit more detail, perhaps from you, Marcelo. Can you help us understand how it is the FAO works specifically on technical assistance around fisheries management and how that might be relevant in this context? Go ahead.
Thank you, Alice, and good afternoon to everybody. Can you hear me well?
Yes, perfect.
All right. It's a pleasure to be here to contribute to this session. I prepared a presentation I'm going to share in a minute. Let's see if it works. Just let me know if you can see it.
We can. You might just need to put it into full screen mode.
Okay.
Perfect. There it is.
Like this? Okay. Thank you so much. So very briefly, I'm a fishery officer here with the FAO headquarters. Thank you again, Alice, and in your group for inviting us to participate. And the idea of this talk is to very briefly go through the relevance of fisheries management in the context of SDG targets in general, and also on the discussions going on now at WTO level regarding subsidies and overfishing. Talk a little bit about the type of technical assistance FAO have been providing countries in terms of fisheries management, and also a bit on the mechanisms to access this technical assistance. And I guess that one of the key messages I want to leave behind is that strengthening fisheries management will be key to address many of the targets, if not all, that we have under SDG 14, including sustainable fishing, of course, ending subsidies contributing to overfishing, and so on. Capacity technical assistance and capacity development will be instruments that we can use to strengthen this fisheries management globally. And FAO is ready to support countries on this, and WTO members, of course. The point in case here, as you know, FAO monitors the status of fisheries research globally for over 50 years. And what you see here is a well-known figure that many use, showing the status of the most important fish stocks globally. What you see in green are stocks that are considered sustainable. In red and reddish color, unsustainable fish stocks. And we see this trend of increasing the number of stocks that are considered overfished over time. And we ask ourselves how we revert this. How can we revert this trend and meet the SDG targets, no? Which is, I mean, we're talking about the basic elements here of sustainability, no? Maintaining our fish stocks healthy. And evidence shows that, in fact, when you intensify your fisheries management, you can revert this trend. You can improve the situation of fish stocks. And these are a paper recently released by many authors showing exactly that. No? When we talk about fisheries management, we mean different things. This is a definition coming from FAO, no? Defining it formally. I like particularly the graph that you see on the right that shows what it entails now when we talk fisheries management. So it's basically an integrated process of planning the use of fisheries resources for sustainable use and for other fisheries objectives. And this process of planning involves different steps, setting objectives for your fisheries, formulating management measures, policies, and actually implementing those. And implementation means also different things. It means putting the measures in place, enforcing them, monitoring to make sure that the fishery is moving in the direction that you're wishing for, doing assessments of the situation, and reviewing your overall management plan over time. There are two, maybe the most important elements of this whole process that we call fisheries management. Is first, we need to do this in consultation with all stakeholders involved or affected by fisheries. And the other element of importance here to highlight is the use of science, of knowledge. Without knowledge, without science, without information, it's very hard to do any decent fisheries management. So these are some of the, let's say, key message regarding fisheries management and what it entails. Of course, we can talk about fisheries management at different scales, from a very local bay where you can have, a co-management arrangement in place between government and communities, to the national level type of fisheries management that you're looking at managing stocks in your EEZs, to, as Aldo mentioned before, management at regional level involving, in this case, regional fisheries management organizations. So it's strengthening this thread of fisheries management actions at these different scales will be super important if we are really serious about meeting those targets. Talking a bit about the FAO technical assistance on fisheries management. First of all, our work, all of our work on fisheries management is guided by the FAO Code of Conduct for Responsible Fisheries, which was adopted by our member countries in 1995, many years ago. And the work actually of technical system capacity building and the support to countries is implemented following an ecosystem approach to fisheries, which is actually a practical way of putting the code of conduct into practice. Through this approach, and that's, I think, very interesting to the discussions we're having today, we look at fisheries from these different dimensions, and from the different 3 dimensions of sustainable development. We look at fisheries from the ecological well-being dimension, where we are interested in maintaining stocks, which is called here retained species, like the target species. We want to maintain them at sustainable levels of exploitation. But we want to avoid also collateral effects of fishing on other ecosystem components, no? So bycatch, you heard this word before, and also the impacts of fisheries on ecosystems in general. But we want also to ensure that we address human well-being issues. Fisheries, as you know, are important for socioeconomic development, for food security, for employment, and so on in different parts of the world. There are many bottlenecks here affecting the capacity of managing fisheries to address and to reach, I mean, this human well-being goals. And without addressing those issues now at community and at national level, it's very hard to meet actually the ecological well-being objectives, because one thing, I mean, can block the other, no? So we have to look at those different dimensions. And of course, the third axis here in this figure is what we call the ability to achieve. So it's really the institutional dimension of sustainability, and how we have set up the right governance arrangements to actually implement measures that will lead us to meet those two, human well-being and ecological well-being goals. No? So here is the importance of mechanisms such as enforcement, monitoring. Do we have enough mechanisms of participation of stakeholders in the process of managing fisheries, and so on? Of course, when we are not isolated when we talk about fisheries on an ecosystem context. We need to look at the interactions that are going on external to your fishery. And so in terms of ability to achieve, we also try to look into the impacts of external factors such as climate, or also markets, market fluctuations, how these affect the capacity of my fishery to perform, and so on. So addressing those factors of vulnerability, these external factors of vulnerability, is also an important component here when we talk about an ecosystem approach to fisheries. So our technical assistance and capacity building has been focused so much on this, I mean, on mainstreaming this concept of looking at fisheries from this very wide angle, helping countries set up management plans, develop management plans guided by this concept. And through this process, we also identify bottlenecks in terms of capacity development. No? So one thing we're going to talk in a minute is information, and how to make all of this operational. You need information, you need knowledge, you need monitoring tools. All of this is important as part of capacity development. And through this process of planning, you actually identify this very clearly, and you can address those limitations in a very precise way. Yes, talking about data collection and analysis, all of this is fundamental to fisheries management. No? Like I mentioned before, I mean, without knowledge, without information, it's very hard, very difficult to make anything operational. And here, when we provide assistance to countries, we go from the very bottom problems of perhaps not having countries not having the right, perhaps, data collection systems that will help them making decisions later on how best to manage their fisheries. And here there is a wide range of issues that can be addressed through technical assistance. For instance, setting up surveys at sea to understand the situation of your stocks, or monitoring your fishery in terms of vessels, of landings, and so on, or even conducting surveys to identify and to define, describe the situation, the socioeconomic situation of your fishery. No? So how are we performing in terms of indicators, basic indicators such as employment, involvement of women, youth in fisheries, and so on. Of course, collecting data is one thing. You have to have the capacity to analyze this data, and before you can analyze it, you have to have means to databases and systems, information systems, to store this type of information somewhere and make it available to reporting mechanisms and so on. So another, let's say, topic of assistance that we have been working on is helping countries set up these information systems where they can use this information collected in the field and transform this into something usable for fisheries management. The third topic here is, of course, once you collected the information, you store it in your information systems, is what to do with it, what type of analysis you can do. One typical limitation we see all over the world is the capacity to assess actually the status of stocks. So there are many different methods available. They can be used for different types of contexts, different type of data availability. So we dedicate a lot of time here also on helping countries understand and use these methods for assessing stocks and fisheries in the best way possible. Of course, all of these will lead, as I mentioned before, to good advice to your fisheries management. So if you have good collection systems, good information systems to assess and analyze this information, of course, you can actually provide good information for your decision maker at the end of the road. In terms of technical guidelines and tools and materials, there are plenty of things that have been produced by FAO in this past decades. And I'm showing here some of the publications that are available. Of course, these are widely disseminated to our member countries. They are available in our websites. Of course, any of you interested, we can provide copies and further references. We are not only developing technical guidelines and tools. Our technical assistants involve a lot of work in the field. This map shows, it's like a X-ray of where we have been working this past decade or so around the world. And we can say around 75 countries have somehow benefited from some type of technical assistance towards the implementation of this approach that I described. We have been helping countries develop more than 50 management plans, for fisheries of different scales. We have ongoing 4 large projects and programs in different parts of the world, some of them funded by Jeff, for instance. I'm going to talk this in a minute. And we are also, through this process, supporting some of the RFMOs, the regional fisheries bodies, in improving the information basis for making decisions and also improving elements of their fisheries management in accordance with this overall approach. How to access all of this, how to access technical assistance from FAO. There are 2 mechanisms. One is directly from FAO. We have different mechanisms inside FAO to provide technical assistance, to fund it. One is what we call the TCP agreement, is a technical cooperation program, which basically relies on the use of FAO funds. They are usually small projects, small programs, and they have a more catalytic role. So they are small grants of small funds that can allow you to develop larger programs or set up the basis to maybe access larger, funds from other sources. Then we have a UTF agreement, which is a unilateral trust fund agreement, which is basically funds from the country to technical assistance, where FAO provides the technical side of assistance. But the funding here comes exactly from the country, it's not from FAO funds. And the third and most important instrument, I would say now in these days, is extra budgetary funds. It's basically funds from donors that are used to help deliver technical assistance in the field. And there are different examples here that this can go to national, regional, to global programs. And Aldo mentioned the PSMA. There is a whole program, multi-donor funds behind it in the implementation, helping in different aspects of technical capacity. Another very well-known program we have for many years and very large in the African continent is the EAF Nansen, that provides technical assistance in different aspects that I mentioned, and so on. So these are the 3 main mechanisms directly involving FAO. And of course, indirectly, we are an accredited agency for working with countries through other mechanisms, such as, financial support that a country may receive, or loans or grants from the World Bank, Africa Development Bank. Or very commonly, we have been working, as I mentioned before, in different projects involving Jeff and the GCF as well. So global funding mechanisms that where we are one of the accredited agencies to provide technical assistance in the implementation of those programs. So in a nutshell, this is the type of the architecture, let's say, of how to access technical assistance, the types of funds and sources that could be used to support and engage in this process. Just to finalize, I don't want to take much more of your time. Some final thoughts. Now, the first, as I mentioned earlier in my presentation, I think strengthening fisheries management will be key to meet sustainable development goals for marine fisheries, including the implementation of any new WTO rules on fisheries subsidies. Technical assistance could address, for instance, in view of these new WTO rules, they could be key for different things, but for instance, improving the information collection, analysis, and reporting, which I think will be one of the key elements from what has been discussed now in terms of the rules, the capacity to report on what's going on in your fisheries in terms of vessels involved in IUU fishing or the status of your stocks. So this will be one key element. Of course, the second one I think is key as well. I mean, the idea of developing management plans and measures for rebuilding overfished stocks. This will be, I think, a especially important element if to implement any rules or if we have any hopes of reverting the trend that I showed early on. And here again, emphasizing they need to look very broadly at this. We cannot rebuild overfished stocks if we don't solve some of the socioeconomic issues around fisheries, and especially the institutional as well. And the third element here is facilitating institutional coordination. No? So I mentioned before, when you implement a fisheries management with this ecosystem approach in mind, one of the key concepts there is participation. No? So you want to engage stakeholders that are key, that are important, that are affected by your fisheries. And here, if you're thinking of establishing new rules regarding subsidies, having agencies dealing with fisheries management, agencies dealing with subsidies, sitting at the table and discussing and looking for options would be super important. So having these mechanisms of institutional coordination well established will be super important here. Of course, through the process of management planning, this can be set up in a way that it can work. No? Final point, again, just to reemphasize what Audun mentioned, we are ready to provide technical assistance and support capacity development actions to strengthen fisheries management as our main goal, but of course, benefiting any agreements that are being negotiated there. And of course, this is upon request of countries and according to the existing mechanisms of technical assistance. I think that's my talk. Thank you very much again, Alice, for the time and opportunity. I hope I didn't pass too much the time. Thank you.
No, not at all, Marcelo. That was very good. And I think that was extremely helpful. Thank you. You know, I don't think I recognized or realized just how much the FAO's technical assistance work looks both at human well-being in the reform of fisheries and the way that they're managed and governed. So I thought that was really interesting. And I think the points about data collection and in particular about institutional coordination that you raised at the end are going to be crucial, right? I mean, one of the really interesting things this agreement, if it's finally approved, does is that it sort of encourages, not to say forces, government agencies to talk to each other about the subsidies provided and the state of stocks. And that kind of coordination work and support, I think, is going to be crucial to any kind of implementation. So it was super to see that on your slide too. You did also mention working with other organizations who can fund a lot of this work and a lot of this reform. So that's probably the perfect segue to you, Charlotte. So thank you very much indeed for joining us. Can you tell us a little bit about what the World Bank is thinking from the Washington perspective about this agreement and your support for its implementation? Go ahead.
Thank you very much indeed, Alice. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here today. Let me just make sure that I can launch my presentation, which if you could just confirm that you could see it.
Yes, and starts with
okay.
There's the title. Super. Go ahead.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here in this meeting, very, very timely in the middle of Fish Week. It's also a pleasure to be back. The bank has been involved in the margins of this process for a number of years now, and it's quite a pleasure to be back where perhaps agreement is at hand and the hard work that everybody's put into this process may be coming to fruition, hopefully will come to fruition. My name is Charlotte de Front-Bert. I am the global lead for the blue economy at the World Bank. I'm originally a fisheries specialist, and I lead our work on the fisheries subsidies reform, which we see as absolutely essential in our fight to address overfishing, but also look at oceans and ocean resources as a tremendous engine for sustainable development. So the reason we're here today and how we got here from the World Bank's perspective is 5 years ago, we put out a significant report on the economic situation of fisheries. And specifically, we looked with a hard economic lens at how much was being lost or foregone as a result of overcapacity and overfishing. And let me just give you, if I may, briefly some main points about our findings. Our findings were rather shocking. And through a series of modeling efforts, what we were able to show is that we estimated that overcapacity is such that we looked at an optimal scenario where we could reduce global fishing effort by about 40%. And what was tremendous from the modeling that we carried out is that we showed, first of all, I think perhaps most striking, and it's always good to start with what's happening in the water, we were able to show an increase in global fish biomass, more than doubled from 215 to 500 million. That in turn, if you think about it, if there are more fish, there are more fish to be caught, which ultimately means more revenue. One of the twin goals of the World Bank is to reduce extreme poverty. And this is the lens that we're applying here. We're trying to maximize the human benefits that Marcelo very eloquently highlighted. So we did basic modeling and we looked at what would happen if we if the global fisheries operated under a maximum economic yield scenario. And this is my favorite part of the presentation because it's so counterintuitive, but basically we were able to show that with less capacity and better effort, you're able to land more fish by fishing less. So more catches, but less effort. And that's, it's very logical from a biological standpoint. If you give the fish stocks a break, you will have larger fish, healthier stocks. And in turn, it will be easier for fishermen to go after those fish. The prices will be higher. So again, if you bear with me, the idea that you can fish less but catch more, which obviously we look at from a perspective of food security and poverty reduction. And then we put it in economic terms and hard cash financial terms, because that tends to be what grabs decision makers' attention. And we showed an almost 30-fold increase in the net benefits that could be accrued. There will be some variations from year to year, and the situation is changing, including with climate change. But think about what we call the sunken billions, is about $80 billion a year that are basically lost to this combination of lower fish level well, we can achieve by fishing less, but also catching more. So that was where we were about 5 years ago. And then in this context, we started to think about, well, what is it that is driving this overcapacity, this drive to fish too much, which we know is having negative results on the fish, on the people, on everyone, and economically. And then the natural progression, if you will, from our perspective, is we started thinking about, well, what role exactly are subsidies having in this counterintuitive situation where we know we're not being, well, the global fleet is not behaving rationally. And what we tried to look at, and we're still looking at, we're trying to illustrate, and we're doing some further modeling at the regional level in Mauritania and the Eastern China Sea, South China Sea, But what we're trying to see is really focus on, and here we're completely aligned with the work of the FAO and SDG 14 and the global agenda. It's really this idea of focusing on distorting fishery subsidies, those that prevent rational economic actors from making rational economic decisions. And there's something here I want to say that's very, very important. The World Bank does not look at fishery subsidies reform as a chance for governments to get out of fisheries management. Again, I'm referring to the many points that Marcelo has made, but rather we want to support efforts to redirect these subsidies along a more productive path. So I think everybody knows a little bit about the different types of subsidies, the good, some that we call the good, the bad, and the ugly, those that distort, those that support. And for instance, a lot of the management measures that Marcelo was mentioning, that would be a type of subsidization where the government helps, supports the development of a healthy fishery with support from FAO and others. So from that perspective, then, this is where the bank has been trying to see what our role is at this broad table, and how we can help client countries engage on this path to more sustainable fishery. And one thing that's really shocking is that often when we start talking with a client country about the fishery situation, one of the first things we want to look at is the extent to which that government is subsidizing their fisheries. And a shocking finding is that the governments don't necessarily understand or are not necessarily aware of the extent to which they are subsidizing fisheries. It can be subsidies on petrol, it can be direct subsidies, but often it's not even captured accurately. So here, one of the first things that we tried to do was develop a PER, to public expenditure review, specifically for the purposes of helping governments understand or realize or quantify the extent to which they are subsidizing the sector, and then further down the line, whether this kind of support is actually helpful or not. The other thing that I would like to switch to now, which I think is terribly important, is that the World Bank sees one of its roles in helping cover the cost of necessary reforms. So what we're saying is, by redirecting the subsidies, you can take a government measure from one that causes or fuels an issue, a problem, a situation, which is overfishing, overcapacity, and then is there not a role for the government to play where they can actually finance the necessary cost of reforms? I think we have to be very realistic here and honest with ourselves. The fact of the matter is that the situation of overfishing and overcapacity that we're in is one that occurred almost naturally, but at least organically and over many years. And there's a little bit of a status quo. There are some winners and losers. There are some beneficiaries. So when we're saying you have too many boats catching too few fish, which we know is the situation at the global level, and we would like to see a change in that situation, essentially what this means is that governments are going to be called upon to take difficult measures that are going to be socially difficult and costly. So one of the things we want to encourage is, once the situation is understood in terms of how much is being subsidized, can this support, at the end of the day, subsidies are government support to a sector. There is no reason why this support can then not be redirected to helping the transition to a sustainable fishery, rather than perpetuating it and fueling it and encouraging it. From the World Bank, then we narrow it down to what is our key role, what is our comparative advantage. And we are, within the bank, we have a broad ocean portfolio of more than $7 billion. And the fisheries portfolio that we support is in the hundreds of millions of dollars. And what we're thinking is, if we align ourselves, and we do, with the political momentum, if you will, that is blowing right now in Geneva, we can help them implement this reform that you've all been working on so very, very hard. And then we can bake it in, if you will, in bank fisheries operations. So that is where we are. the bank has made a strong commitment. We have been working on this issue for a long time, so I have a few more details about the public expenditure review, but that's perhaps a little bit technical. But so I just want to focus again on what it is that the bank can do in terms of understanding the reality of the economic situation with a view to softening, if you will, the social cost of reform. So I think a good way to think about this is the World Bank stands ready. We have started our commitment to helping in implement some fishing subsidies reform, and we will take obviously careful note of the new measures that will be adopted by the WTO. And then we stand ready to, as a financial engine working with the FAO and others, we stand ready to then translating this political commitment that's being adopted in Geneva and then implemented on the ground, or as the case may be here in the water. And I'm going to leave it at that, Alice, so we can have time for questions. Thank you.
Super. Thank you very much indeed, Charlotte. And I think, a couple of things that I think are worth kind of extracting and highlighting there is the emphasis that I think you quite rightly put on the fact that this implementation needs to be about redirecting public support, right? And I think, in fact, if you read the agreement, there's not a lot there about kind of quantitatively cutting support. It's about making sure that support reflects the nature of the resource and is properly integrated as a fiscal response to fisheries management, and that there's a coherence between those two areas of policy. Ensuring that that redirection supports transitions to sustainable fisheries, I think, is important. And I was very encouraged again at the end, just to hear you say talk about the bank's willingness to consider the outcomes of the negotiation and to think about how the bank's fisheries operations can be shaped to ensure that they support the commitments that governments have taken here in Geneva. I think that was an important message, and one that's, I hope, is well received in the room here and online. Well, that's all been extremely helpful. And we've heard, I think, from two of the major agencies who will be involved in helping to support the implementation of this agreement. But we did very much want to have a perspective from outside Geneva, but from somebody who does this work on a day-to-day basis. And John, thank you very much indeed for joining us. We've been working with MRAG on the self-assessment tool that Yeva will be talking about in a moment. But we've asked John to talk separately from that, really about his own experience of technical assistance, particularly for the implementation of international agreements. And from his many years of experience, what we can think about now to make sure that implementation works well. So John, the floor is yours, and I think you have slides which you're welcome to put up now if you wish.
Thank you, Alice, and thank you for that introduction. I just share that. Hopefully everybody can see that.
We can, it's perfect. Go ahead.
Brilliant, thank you. So just a quick introduction to myself. My name is John Pearce, as Alice introduced me. I work for MRAG, the Marine Resource Assessment Group, based out of London. I've got nearly 30 years experience working with fisheries management around the world. And quite a lot of my experience has been assisting in putting agreements together, whether they're agreements like this or agreements in the form of regional fisheries management organizations and the way that they operate and have the agreement of neighboring states to work together. Both putting those together, working with the implementation of those, and then actually implementing them, either with third-party countries or as part of the UK delegation myself. So I've got that wide variety of practical experience. I've been key. I was one of the members of the group that provided the first big global estimate of IUU fishing, and I've worked on subsidies projects in the past as well. So I've got that wide variety of background that kind of allows me that insight into how things work and how things don't work in some cases and how to avoid those pitfalls. So with any large scale agreement, whether it's an agreement like this on subsidies or a regional fisheries agreement or whatever, the requirements of those agreements can appear to be complex and extensive. And the diversity of reporting requirements that run alongside each of those agreements may actually cause concern and worry to some of the parties involved. This is particularly true in my experience of small states or small developing states, particularly small island developing states for fisheries agreements, on their actually capacity to implement any agreement. They're often fully committed in just doing their day-to-day management. Collecting the data, as Marcelo introduced earlier, is a huge part of that, analysing that, managing their stocks to make sure, either as a local stock or as part of a regional agreement, that they can actually do that job. And then suddenly they find that their minister has agreed to a new agreement and they have another load of reporting requirements. This is very common. And luckily, the situation is not as bad as people think. Usually it's going to require input from all states. One of the critical things, particularly with this agreement, I think, is the null reporting. The reporting when nothing occurs, because that's where we want to all get to with fisheries subsidies that are impacting on overcapacity, overfishing, or subsidising illegal, unreported or unregulated fishing. We actually want to get to a zero state. So the more states that just, if they don't report, they're unknown. We don't know what's happening. So it's critical that when we do report, if we have nothing, we report nothing, so that that can be understood and we can actually recognise that progress is being made, i.e. more countries are getting to that zero state. As has been stated by most of the other people, most of the other presenters before me, all the states will benefit from more sustainable fisheries, which fisheries without the adverse impacts of negative subsidies will hopefully be more sustainable. And this isn't just fishing nations. It will be coastal states that may license their fisheries out. It will be importers, processors, exporters. The whole downward chain of fisheries management will benefit. What I'll focus on are three small elements, and I don't want to take too much time over this, but focusing on the information requirements, gathering and notifications process, where potential support to assist in the implementation of the agreement could come from, and where different parties fit in, and lessons I've learned, simple lessons from previous experience, giving good practice examples. So looking at the information gathering and the notification requirements first, what information is required? Well, we'll need information on the fisheries, simply. Information on subsidies, information on all the processes in place, and a notification process to actually get that information to the WTO. Now, those will all come from different elements of government. The information in your fisheries will come from your Ministry of Fisheries, Department of Fisheries, who are collecting the information. They'll know what the fleets are. They'll know what their catches are. They'll know about, in conjunction with the legal and ministries of justice or other bodies, where the illegal fishing is occurring in your fleets, in your fisheries, but also reporting on other states that have fished illegally in your waters. I'm involved in, through IOTC, the Indian Ocean Tuna Commission at the moment, the process of listing other vessels that have been fishing illegally in other states. And it's actually increasing year on year as the economic pressures add So those fleets, they're fishing further and further away. So it's becoming more important to report internationally on who's fishing illegally in other zones. Then we're looking at the information on subsidies. That'll be coming from probably a trade ministry who are actually giving out subsidies, independent of fisheries sometimes. And there's often very little overlap between those two. The information on the processes of reporting on illegal fishing or everything will be done through Ministry of Justice possibly. And it's working together to bring all this information together to report and meet the obligations of this proposed agreement. So all the information is probably already collected by these different agencies, but who will submit it? Who's going to take responsibility? Now, I don't mind. I've worked with all the ministries I've described in various countries at one stage or another. But it's key that one agency or one ministry takes the lead, that they can then collect the information as required from each of their partner ministries and then submit it and be that one focal point, one point of contact that can provide and liaise on that country's behalf. That makes so much sense and makes the system a lot simpler when it's actually implemented. But then we have the concern about how all this is going to be paid for. So luckily, I think, you know, this without talking with Marcelo beforehand, exactly what Marcelo was saying is what I would say actually applies in the real world. Most of these new agreements or new fisheries management organization requirements generate a level of publicity and discussion. The higher the profile, the higher the importance of the agreement, the more likely there are options for support and technical assistance. And when that support is requested, donors will normally supply it. If there's a demand, the donors will go, yeah, we'll address that. If nobody says anything, the donor organizations will think, it's okay, they can all deal with it. It might not be the case. So if you have a problem, tell people about it. Make it clear that, hey, we want to be involved in this process. We want to do it properly. We want to be able to submit the information as required and remove subsidies in our country. But we don't have the capacity, or we don't have the skills. The legal framework was mentioned earlier. These are all key. And the assistance can come through a variety of sources. I've worked for FAO before. I've worked for the European Commission, for governments, on GEF projects. All of these working to give that technical assistance to countries. One of the key ones that's increased in recent years are NGOs with vested interest. So organizations such as Pew, WWF are well known for investing in fisheries projects around the world. Very targeted assistance that address specific problems. And one of these was the Port State Measures Agreement that recently, well, I say recently, it's been in place for a few years now. But I know, because I've worked with various organizations working in countries, helping them set up their port state control, helping them train port inspectors. And again, this was both fisheries, but trade, customs, authorities, again, a wide variety of bodies, but one of the key things was making sure that they all work together. With the Port State Measures Agreement, it's everyone, I remember we were saying in the Indian Ocean, where I do quite a lot of work, there was a lot of concern that, oh, how are we going to do this? How can we manage it? We don't know what we're doing. And then we pointed out, you've already been doing it for about 4 years through the Indian Ocean Tuna Commission, whose requirements are virtually identical to what ended up being in the Port State Measures Agreement. They were already doing it for their tuna fisheries, and all they needed to do was expand it. Now, that took a bit of work to expand it to their other fisheries, but it was very simple once they realized what was needed for those countries who were already implementing it. And we'd already done the training. And with colleagues in South Africa, there was a lot of training around the Indian Ocean. So the support is there and can always be, rolled out when it's required. Finally, I'll just talk about good practice on implementation and support. You'll note here I don't use the phrase best practice, which is always a favorite of everybody, simply because there is no one best practice solution. Each country's situation with their fisheries, their legal frameworks, their port infrastructure, their management authorities will all be different. So it's more a series of good practice examples rather than one best practice solution. One of the key ones is that donors listen to support needs and respond to those. That does happen with FAO and many other organizations. It's key that that carries on. It's key also that government departments, as I've said, work together and do not engage in that internal squabbling. I've seen it happen too many times where there's, my ministry's bigger than yours, I must take the lead. No, work out who is best to deliver, who can best provide that interface between your whole country's organizations and WTO to present the information and get it done. Work with your neighbours, not just internally, work with neighbouring states. Neighbouring states are likely to have similar fisheries, similar problems, similar IUU, similar capacity issues. Work with them, see what works with them, share your successes and failures with them, and then it will work. That really does work. Working together on a sub-regional, regional basis really does enable progress to occur. And the last one here that I'll mention is that don't disengage from the process. When states take a step back and don't actually do anything, nobody learns whether they're doing the job well, whether they're doing the job poorly, or whether they're just not doing anything. Continue to take the small steps forward, and continued progress is better than nothing. We often work with agreements that have penalty clauses and sanctions in them. And everyone is scared that if they report and they don't do it right, they're going to get sanctioned. If you show progress, you won't get sanctioned. There won't be a problem. Everybody will actually thank you for the progress you've made. And if you can show progress, you're more likely to get support from donors than a country that's not doing anything. Being able to demonstrate success actually brings in more support and enables you to move forward quicker and better. And the last one, which will lead on to the presentation of the tool in a few moments, is use any publicly accessible resources and tools. You saw the range of documentation that Marcelo presented earlier on all the documents, the management tools that are in place through FAO. Anything that comes up to support this agreement, use them, learn from them, take them forward. Because that, if something exists and we all use it together, we can adapt that and build on that. But if we all try doing different things, it doesn't work as cleanly, and it's not as successful a way forward in being able to, you know, actually get a win on this, and actually reduce subsidies, reduce overcapacity, reduce overfishing, reduce IUU, which is the, you know, to get better sustainable fisheries, all those three things need to be reduced, and reduce the subsidies that contribute to them. I'll leave it there, but as with others, I'm open for questions and comments. Thank you.
John, thank you. That was both really usefully practical, I think, for those of us who spend a lot of time in the negotiating world, but really useful and practical, and notwithstanding very encouraging. Dare I say, actually slightly inspiring. So I feel even more confident now than I did at the beginning of your presentation. So thank you, that was really helpful. I did want to pause before we get onto the tool discussion, just in case there are comments or questions. I can see we have David from UNCTAD who has his hand up, and I think Isabel has her in-person flag up. But if anyone else would like to contribute, to ask any questions or make any comments before we get onto the very last bit, now's the moment. Feel free to put your little wooden nameplate holder up if you'd like to take the floor. But I might give the floor perhaps first to you, David, and then I'll hand it over to Isabel. Go ahead, David.
Thank you very much, Alice. First, I would like to thank this very timely initiative by IISD and partners. I also would like to acknowledge the hard work of my colleagues in the FAO on this matter, and also colleagues that have presented today from the World Bank and others. I wanted to mention first that in the case of UNCTAD, we have a specific mandate to support the negotiation and implementation of a WTO Fish Subsidies agreement. This was agreed at the UNCTAD 15 conference in Bridgetown. A strong emphasis was placed in the aspects of special and differential treatment, especially by vulnerable countries such as SIDS and LDCs. Now, in this context, we need to understand that the WTO Fish Subsidies agreement, hopefully agreed in the next weeks, will be a sui generis case, in the sense that all law of the seas, all fisheries agreement, and soft law so far has been produced under the UN system over the last 50 years. Subsidies has not been usually dealt with in the UN system in these agreements. So this WTO agreement will be an essential piece to complement existing oceans and fisheries governance, and perhaps in the road to the UN Oceans Conference and the high-level political forum in Lisbon and in New York in the next months, it will be the WTO Fish Subsidies Agreement, perhaps the most important outcome in the implementation of SDG 14. In this sense, a WTO Fish Subsidies Agreement will benefit all, as it will imply a limit on the allocation of public resources for unsustainable activities, while keeping the policy space to subsidize and support sustainable activities. And I think that needs to be very clear, so the treaty can be seen in a very positive light. Also, it's as a complement. Without a WTO subsidies agreement, all countries will be worse off. It implies that all countries can subsidize any type of activity, anytime, for as long as they want, in a situation with limited resources and vulnerability of stocks and depletion in many cases. So no lack of rules is going to be a situation of worse off in relation to who's going to be able to manage resources without distortion and without fueling unsustainable practices. Now, in UNCTAD, I just wanted to mention two things. In UNCTAD, as of today, we can provide certain form of support. We have the UN Oceans Forum, which is a unique platform on trade, which is multi-agency and multi-stakeholder, and many of you are partners and have participated in this. Second, UNCTAD has the first ever ocean trade database. It's already online, and you can compare not only fisheries, but all oceans-based good sectors, and we will upload the services one in the next 2 months and this will be important to us undertake blue economy analysis as mentioned by the World Bank. We can also offer as vehicle of implementations, ocean economy and trade strategies have been tested in several countries together with DOALOS and FAO. And we also have a very specific blue biotrade approach for small scale, high value marine species, including CITES listed. So that could be also very important to be able to address, especially in the year of the artisanal fisheries and aquaculture, an angle to support also these objectives. Now, I wrote recently with my colleagues Marcio Sousa de Castro and Victoria Chomo an op-ed that I will share in the chat. I know we don't have time, where we propose a roadmap of the different actions that would be needed for implementation on the size of the country. There are 10 actions that could be backed and could be developed that implies methodological approach, coordination approach, different type of policies at different levels. So I will just share it because we don't have time, but thank you very much for the opportunity to participate today. Thank you.
No, thank you very much indeed, David. And we did want to make sure that UNCTAD was part of this conversation because we know how much work you've been doing on this. I see only one flag up, which I think is Isabel's. If anyone else would like to ask questions, make comments, feel free. But if everything was perfectly clear, then no need, then we're fine. Isabel, would you like to take the floor? Sorry, go ahead.
Sure, Alice, and thank you very much to IISD and to all the speakers for the session today. It was very interesting and also really timely. It's really great to be here in Geneva and see all the hard work that negotiators have put into reaching agreement, seemingly coming to fruition. Let's fingers crossed. My fingers are crossed for all of you and all of your hard work in the coming weeks. I just wanted to emphasize a point that actually John had made in his slides, and I think sort of building on a theme in terms of what support there might be out there for implementation. Certainly Pew has been involved in the implementation of the PSMA agreement, as John pointed out, but I think that with an agreement being reached, there's likely support from others, including Pew, but as John mentioned, other NGOs, but also maybe other foundations as well. So I do think that, of course, success breeds in some ways support and hopefully more success. So this is the very beginning, I think, of the conversation about implementation and about what resources and what support there is available. And I think that with success, you'll be surprised by how many different folks are interested in supporting the work going forward. So just wanted to sort of emphasize that point and really hammer it home so that negotiators hear that I think there will be a lot of support from various different places with success. Thanks.
Super, and apologies, I realized I should have probably introduced you. Isabel Jarrett.
I should have introduced myself.
That's just fine. So Isabel Jarrett, who's been leading the Pew Foundation, the Pew Charitable Trust's support for all of our work here at IISD on supporting your Fisheries Subsidies Agreement negotiations. And Isabel sits within kind of quite a large multilateral environment program within the Pew Charitable Trusts. So I think can speak with some authority about how the foundations have supported PSMA work, IUU work. There's a wide range of ocean work that goes on under Pew. So we thought it would be useful to have her chip in as the voice from the foundation side of things.
I just wanted to add, I think maybe I stayed a little bit theoretical in my first intervention. Alice, I just want to mention that the World Bank, with support from 14 states and entities, has set up a new multi-donor trust fund called ProBlue in support of the blue economy, which has specifically a pillar on fisheries. So the bank, I would say, is putting its money where its mouth is. And we are using this fund specifically to help our client countries on this path to sustainability. A lot of it is technical assistance. And I know this is something that's very important in the context of these negotiations. I don't think we can expect everyone to sign on to reform if there is not a sense that the cost of this reform is going to be shared. And here again, I would like just to say that the World Bank will play its share of the role.
Super. Very clear, Charlotte, and super practical and helpful. So thank you very much for chipping in. That was really good. I've been really unfair to my own colleague, Yeva. She was meant to have 15 minutes for her presentation, and I think I'm going to have to ask her to do it in like 5 or 6 or 7. But we did want to just make sure that you were aware of the self-assessment tool that we've been working on, particularly because at the very end of John's presentation, he talked about the use of publicly available tools. And we wanted to make sure you all knew that there will be one for you. And this is a bit what it looks like. So Yeva, go ahead.
And looking at a watch, 5 is a maximum time that I will be asking from you here. But just to introduce a little bit of work that me and my colleague Tristan, whom you see down there, have been so much engaged at, looking at the day when the agreement is struck and the question of what now is happening in 164 capitals. And we understand that there will be no single one way to approach the implementation of a new agreement. However, we started putting some guidance together to help members at least evaluate their situation as they stand on the day that the agreement is struck, and to see if they have systems, mechanisms, and regulations in place to make sure that they can actually successfully implement the agreement, identify the gaps, and if those exist, see if they can fix them by themselves or they actually need to go to the donors who are hanging on a call in a room or might be just present somewhere around the corner. So simple as that, our self-assessment tool is a set of 2 documents that consists of a checklist of a number of questions that guide you through the obligations of a new fisheries subsidies agreement, one by one, asking 2 types of questions. First type of question is related to your current compliance level. Are you ready? Are you in compliance as you are? The second type of questions are what we call the implementation steps, and they ask you, are your systems ready to do this, this, and that? We have a guide that is supporting the users' work on the checklist that is helping the users to understand what the questions are about, how they should be responded, and what is expected to be done. In general, the aim of the tool was to help the WTO members to identify and collect the key information and data that would be needed for implementation. As I mentioned, assess the current level of compliance, as well as whether they have systems and mechanisms in place that are there to ensure the ongoing compliance and identify gaps, possible technical assistance, capacity building needs, and having this list ready, see what can be done next. What the tool is not, this tool is not any kind of official legal interpretation of a new agreement. The IISD is not a WTO, and we don't provide any official interpretations. Neither do we provide legal advice, so don't take us to court with this one. However, this tool is also something that is meant for the government's use only. The IISD will not be standing behind your shoulder and checking what replies are being inserted in all those checklist tables. Neither will be the WTO Secretariat or any other member. This is meant for any government, and first and foremost, developing country and LDC members governments that might not have the capacity to run this type of thorough self-assessment internally by themselves without those type of tools. So I will leave it here. I have a long set of slides. If anybody is willing to talk to me, I'm very happy to run anyone through this work in much more detail. But considering the time and the fact that we might all need a shot of coffee before running to the next meetings, I leave it here. But that's just an invitation to talk to me later.
Super. Thank you, Yeva. That was very noble, because I know just how good the slides are because I've seen them before. Listen, I am conscious of time, so I'm going to say 4 things. And I don't think I'm overstating anything here, but I guess the messages I get, there is support, in particular from the bank, but from other places, for subsidy reform. There is support for fisheries management out there, including for data collection and including for institutional coordination. There is funding available. We've had some useful lessons from practice, including the fact that with agreement, support will come. You just need to ask. And I think one of the key messages from Yeva is that there will be, thanks to the generous support of our donors, a tool available to help you identify how you are doing and to help you ask for the support that you need. Right? So this is our effort to make sure that we're helping you to connect the dots, and we're helping to make sure that the support will be there once the agreement is concluded. So with that, thank you all very much for joining us in person. Thank you to the 20 or so who have joined online. Sincere thanks to all of our speakers. We're really grateful that you've given us some of your time. We know how busy a time of year it is, particularly those of you who aren't feeling terribly well. And I hope you don't mind if we circulate your slides and perhaps even your contact details to those who've attended in case they have follow-up questions. So thank you very much, everyone. Good luck with the rest of the negotiations, and you know where to find us if you have questions or if you want to talk to Yeva about the tool. So thank you very much indeed, and goodbye everyone online. Thanks for joining.